Dr. Johnny Bowden is a board-certified nutritionist, a best-selling author, and international expert on cholesterol, weight loss, and anti-aging. His no-nonsense, myth-busting approach has made him a popular TV guest, lecturer, and columnist. He has featured in 2 documentaries and authored 15 books. His controversial best-selling book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, which he co-authored with cardiologist Dr. Sinatra, is the reason I invited him to chat with me today. You are listening to Menopause Natural Solutions, episode 150, The Great Cholesterol Myth with Dr. Johnny Bowden. Welcome to Menopause Natural Solutions, your podcast for all things perimenopause, menopause and beyond. Stay tuned as your host, naturopath Jennifer Harrington, explains how to use natural therapies to find your ultimate health and happiness during your transition. Welcome. Today I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Johnny, who is one of my number one experts. His work on cholesterol in particular has really caught my attention. It has changed the way and influenced the way that I practice and I support women with midlife cholesterol. So, Johnny, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. It's so nice to be here, and it's so nice to know that I have actual people in Australia who've read my work. Very flattering.
I'm sure it's not just in Australia. I'm sure it's a global phenomenon. It's just such a groundbreaking book, and it's not a new book.
The new edition is new. That came out just a couple of years right before Dr. Sinatra died. The book itself is not new, but we did a complete revamp and revision based on all of the newest research, and that new edition is the one that I recommend people read because that's got the stuff you need to know about.
Fabulous. And there's also a cookbook as well.
There is.
Yes. So, Johnny, why are you so passionate about cholesterol? How did it all start?
Well, because it's the one area, it's probably not the only area. At this point, there's a lot of them, but it's certainly one of the most dramatic areas in which we have been misled about our health risks and what we should do about them. When you think about it, the only justification for the dietary recommendations that we've all been blindly following since about 1986, low fat, stay away from animal products, by all means don't eat cholesterol, and God knows you can't eat any saturated fat. Those are all based on the notion that those foods raise LDL cholesterol, and we all know that if you raise LDL cholesterol, you're going to have a heart attack. Now, if that's not true, what happens to the dietary recommendations? What happens to the stuff we've been told to do for 40 years? It crumbles like a house of cards because it's built on a false premise. So it's hard to think of an area that has had more influence on the way people eat, the way people take care of themselves, the risk factors people believe they have or don't have, than the whole notion of good and bad cholesterol and saturated fat causing heart disease. Those things are not true. They're not based on science. And they've been in terribly, terribly destructive influences on our health. They're not the only ones. There are some other good ones we can talk about as well, but certainly that's one of the biggest.
Well, let's stick to cholesterol for now, because that is something that I'm finding in my practice anyway, that women are still coming in with the old advice. They're still just doing their total cholesterol, HDL and LDL.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not the test that you recommend.
That test is antiquated. It's way past its expiration date. It's 1963 medicine. It's like using a Ouija board to do calculus. It simply is something that we now know doesn't really provide useful information in terms of prevention or diagnosis. It's outdated. We now know, for example, that there are 13 different, it may even be more than 13, but there are 13 identifiable subtypes of cholesterol, LDL-A, LDL-B, LDL-3A, 3B, HDL-2A, 2B. There's a million of them, and they don't all behave the same way. And they're certainly not so simplistically categorizable into good and bad. That is like doing medical diagnoses based on if somebody's short or tall. Now, short and tall, kind of important to know that there are certain variables, but you would never make a medical diagnosis or a prescription based on simply that one factor. And yet that is what we are doing. We have a $31 billion a year industry to support the doing of exactly that and the prescription of statin drugs to reduce this measure, which isn't really even the important one to be looking at. And because of that, we have taken our eye off the ball of what really causes heart disease. We've taken our eye off the ball on what we could really do to prevent it or to treat it. And we've just fixated myopically on this one metric, which is outdated and which we continue to slavishly try to lower in the false hope that that's going to lower our risk of dying.
So in that case, what testing do you recommend if you don't recommend the other one?
There have been tests available for at least 15 years called advanced lipid profiles. Every lab, I don't know which ones are used in Australia, but in the United States, we have Quest and LabCorp are the two biggest ones. Every major lab has a form of these tests. They're called particle tests. They're called advanced lipid profiles. They're called cardiac IQ tests. And they look at not just, you see, here's the thing that people need to know. Cholesterol can't travel in the blood. It cannot. It would be like taking some oil and trying to transport it across a lake, not by putting it in a boat, but by just pouring the oil into the water. Well, it ain't going to get there because oil and water don't mix, and cholesterol doesn't mix with liquid. So it has to be in a container. The container is the lipoprotein. There's no good and bad cholesterol. It's the identical cholesterol. In one case, it's carried in a container called an LDL, and in the other case, it's carried in a container called a HDL. The container is different. The cholesterol is the same. It is as if I got on a plane to go visit you in Australia, or I got on a plane to go visit my family in New York. I'm the same passenger. The plane is going a different place. The plane has changed, not the passenger. What the new tests look at is not the passenger, but the number of planes in the air, the number of boats in the water. If you are trying to manage a marina and you don't want any accidents, you don't give a crap about how many towels are in the washroom of the boat. You care about how many boats are in the water, because the boats are the things that crash into one another. Sure, if a boat crashes, it spills towels out into the water, but the towels didn't cause the crash. The boats caused the crash. And in the same way, cholesterol doesn't cause plaque by itself. Damaged particles, lipoproteins. Lipoproteins are the things that get caught inside the endothelial wall of the arteries. They are what cause the damage. When they spill out into the arteries, yes, some cholesterol comes out, some bacteria comes out, calcium comes out. There's a lot of things that come out, but they didn't cause the accident. And we need to start focusing on the containers, on the actual lipoproteins, not on their cargo. The lipoproteins are the boat. The cholesterol is the cargo. The cholesterol is far less important than the boat. And those are the things that the new tests look at. However, you will not get your doctor to order one of those new tests because they're not covered by insurance, because they have no incentive whatsoever to give you a better test, because with the old test, they can just put everybody on statin drugs. Why upset the apple cart? That's making them $31 billion a year. The only thing that made them more money was the vaccine.
Wow. This is what I mean. You are so passionate. You're not afraid to speak your truth. You go out there and say, guys, this is time to myth bust. It's time to get out there and look at what's actually real.
Very important that people understand this, because unfortunately, this method is used across the board and it's accepted by everybody, and it's so deceptive. And let me give you an example. So in the olden days, when Lipitor first came out, they had a an ad. You can still find this on Google Images. You can still dig this up. It said Lipitor reduces heart attacks by 1/3, 33% reduction in heart attacks. Boy, is that impressive sounding, isn't it? Here's what actually happens. Here's how they get the 1/3. Here's how they get the 33%. If you take 100 people, 100 men, over the course of 5 years, it would be expected in a randomized population that in that 100 men, 3 of them would have a heart attack over 5 years. If you take a matched sample of those 100 men, 100 men, you give them a placebo or nothing, 3 of them have a heart attack. If you take that same matched group of 100 men and you give them a statin drug, which comes with a list of side effects this long, and let's not even talk about the expense of it, because most of us don't pay for it because it's all paid for by insurance, but they're very expensive and they have a long list of side effects. And if you give that same 100 men statin drugs for 5 years, you will have 1 less heart attack. So you had 3 heart attacks in the non-treated group, and you have 2 heart attacks in the treated group. That's 1 out of 3. That's your 33%. If they told the truth and they said there's really 1% difference, but they don't. They use the relative statistic of 1 out of 3. It's a 33% difference. And that's where you get those figures, and those are all done by statin drug manufacturers. So, for example, let me give you an even better example. If I have a system that you can take into a casino, and it will guarantee you a 50% increase in your chances of winning the jackpot. 50% increase. Boy, would you pay a lot of money for that? People say, wow, 50% increase in my chances of winning $1 million? Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, well, let's look at what your chances are without the system. 1 in 87 million. That's your chances of winning the lottery. So if I increase that by 100%, now you have 2 in 87 million of a chance. Is that something you pay a lot of money for? Instead of having one in an 87 million chance, you now have 2? Well, that's 100% increase. That's how the statin drug manufacturers do their studies. Now, sadly, it's how everybody does their studies, including the people in the natural foods business. I mean, we all do it. It's called relative statistic. It doesn't tell you the absolute reduction. In the Lipitor study, the absolute reduction was 1 heart attack was saved if you treated 100 men for 5 years. That's a very, very big cost. When you look at the side effects and the increase in diabetes and the increase in all these other things that are really unpleasant, like muscle pain and memory loss and loss of libido and all of the stuff that goes with statins, that's a big cost for 1 heart attack to be saved out of 100 men, 5 years of treatment.
No thanks.
The statin drugs don't save lives. They just don't.
So what's the alternative? You said with the lipoprotein testing, what can we do? What are we looking for in that test?
Well, here's let me shift gears just a minute and talk about what we found in our latest edition of The Great Cholesterol Myth. The thing that seems to predict heart disease better than any other metric is what we commonly call prediabetes. Prediabetes is the technical name for that is insulin resistance syndrome. In America, 88% of us have some degree of insulin resistance, some degree of prediabetes. Prediabetes is diabetes. It just hasn't quite reached the diagnosis part. And diabetes is pre-heart disease. This is one big metabolic continuum. It includes hypertension, obesity, heart disease, prediabetes, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and every comorbidity for COVID. Every one of them is statistically related to insulin resistance. That is what we should be looking at. And insulin resistance is 100% treatable, preventable, and reversible with diet and lifestyle. If we could wipe out prediabetes, we would not have to worry that much about heart disease.
I agree. So let's talk about fixing insulin resistance then.
Okay. So insulin resistance is a condition that happens when your body simply cannot handle effectively the carbohydrate load that you are feeding it. Now, that carbohydrate load can be very different for very different people. The Bantu of South Africa eat 80% of their diet from carbs. They do just fine. The people in Greenland eat 0% of their diet from carbs. They do just fine. The amount of carbs is not the issue. The amount of carbs for you is the issue, for your particular physiology and metabolic makeup. And for most of us, we are simply not genetically prepared or adapted to the amount of processed carbohydrates that we are consuming on a daily basis. Eventually, the system gets overwhelmed. Insulin, whose job it is to bring your blood sugar down and get that blood sugar delivered to the muscle cells, stops being effective. The muscle cells don't need it because you ain't exercising. You're sitting at the computer all day or sitting using the clicker at night in front of the TV. So the muscles don't need the sugar. So they say no more. And they become resistant to the effects of insulin, whose job it is to bring them sugar. Now, for a while, you can manage to escape diabetes because insulin will then say, well, does anybody else want the sugar? And the fat cells say, we'll take it, bring it on in, we'll eat anything. And so for a while, you start to get an expanding waistline, you start to put on some weight, but you're still not diabetic. After a while, even the fat cells say, we're done, no mas, and now you have high blood sugar and high insulin, you've got diabetes. Good luck with that.
Yes.
It ain't cholesterol. It's not cholesterol that's causing the problem. Certainly not eating cholesterol or saturated fat. But all of that does take your eye off the real culprit here, which is sugar and processed food. And we now know from no less a source than the Journal of the American Medical Association, something I don't quote very often, and I tend to think I'm not a huge fan of, but it's probably one of the most respected journals in America for medicine. And they published about 3 or 4 years ago the papers that came out through Freedom of Information Act of how the sugar industry and the sugar lobbyists literally paid researchers such as Mark Hegstead at Harvard, to design research to put blame on fat rather than on sugar.
If we can jump back to cholesterol for a moment.
Cholesterol does valuable things in the body. It is essential. You would die without it. As you pointed out, your brain won't function without it. You won't make vitamin D without it. I always tell this to male audiences, and they go, really? Your sex hormones come from it. It's no coincidence that half the men in America are on statin drugs and also on erectile dysfunction drugs. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so.
No.
So cholesterol is absolutely vital for the body. It would not surprise me to find out, because as Dr. Sinatra pointed out maybe 20 years ago, heart disease presents very differently in women, as you know. It presents differently, different symptoms, different everything. All of these studies, well, just recently they started including women in them, but most of the studies on which we base all of this stuff were done on men. So, that alone should make you at least pause before following, this antiquated advice about putting everybody on statin drugs the minute their total cholesterol goes over 200. I mean, it's such, I know it with every fiber in my bone, in my being, that in 200 years, when we look back on this way of treating heart disease, and we said, oh yeah, we lowered everybody's cholesterol, we put them on we will all collectively just throw our palms to the foreheads and go, what the hell were they thinking about?
Yes. Well, as you've mentioned, there are so many benefits of cholesterol. It's definitely worth, if you are getting an elevated reading, just to take that next step and say, well, let's not just look at the traditional testing. Let's look at the lipoprotein testing and then take it from there. Because there are, even when you say HDL is not necessarily good because there's bad forms of HDL. And you
And there are
can't
good
say,
forms of LDL. That's exactly right. This good and bad. Anyone who has a sophisticated brain should realize that
yeah,
putting complicated, complex, multifactorial things into categories like good and bad is simplistic and moronic. I mean, everybody should be able to see that.
yeah. But I think there were two things on the standard testing, if you've had it done, that you don't mind. I think you don't mind looking at the triglycerides. Is that
Very
correct?
important. Yes, I like looking at triglycerides and HDL, even though with everything that you said about HDL is true, but that particular measure is important because everybody has access to that test.
Mm.
There isn't a doctor in any country ever that doesn't give a complete blood count, and that has 4 measures on it: triglycerides, HDL, LDL, and blood glucose. If you look at triglycerides and HDL and you figure out the ratio between them, and I will tell you how to do it. It's the easiest thing in the world. That number is more predictive of heart attacks and way more predictive of insulin resistance and prediabetes than just about any other number you can look at. Here's how you do that number. Triglycerides are most often the bigger of the two numbers. So let's assume that they're going to be a bigger number. Let's assume your triglycerides are 100. And let's assume your HDL is 50, which is a very good number. So you divide the 50 into the 100, and you get 2. That's the ratio. Mm-hmm. 2 is a very, very good ratio. Now, if you had 150 triglycerides and 30 HDL, you divide 30 into 150, you get 5. That ain't good. That's a high-risk number. And anything between 2 and 5 are respectively. The closer to 2 it is, the better it is. The closer to 5 or over it is, the worse it is.
Fantastic. So that's something we can all do. So
That's
everybody go.
something everybody can do. You don't need your doctor to go against the insurance company and order a test that actually matters, because that test is a very good surrogate for it.
Fabulous.
Something I would like to talk to you about, because I know that guys are very interested in menopause, and that's the theme, is the things that I worry about with menopause in women are stomach acid, prediabetes, and muscle loss. And I'll tell you why. Prediabetes, for just the reasons that I told you, that's whether it's premenopause, postmenopause, whether it's men or women, prediabetes is the plague of the metabolic plague of the 21st century, and we all need to pay attention to that. That's number one. But with women in particular, muscle loss is a huge issue. Now, it's an issue for men too, and there's even there's a clinical name for when it gets to a certain point, it becomes diagnosable, and it's called sarcopenia, which is loss of muscle. But like all these things, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, they're a continuum. And, the point at which it gets to be diagnosed and the point right before that, they're very close. So you don't want muscle loss as you get older. And here's one of the reasons why it's so important for menopause. So 80% of the sugar in your body, in your bloodstream, is cleared by muscle cells. If you don't have as many of them, and you lose about 1 pound a year of muscle if you don't do something to hold on to it. So between 30 and 80, you could lose half of your entire muscle weight. That means you have much less allies on your side in terms of weight loss and weight management. What do menopausal women complain about all the time? They're gaining weight, they're gaining weight, they're gaining. Of course, you've got because the muscles aren't there to help you clear out that blood sugar. So it's very important to hold on to muscles. And I can tell you 3 excellent ways to do that. Number one, you gotta do weight training.
Yes.
One of the best books, and I will recommend this wholeheartedly. I don't sell this book. I don't have any financial interest in this book, but it is written by a good friend of mine who is a menopause expert, Esther Blum, and she wrote a book called See You Later, Ovulator. See You Later, Ovulator, one of the best books on menopause I've ever read. And you know what she says? Menopause is handleable by 2 things: protein, a steak, and a set of barbells. She's very big on something that we are now beginning to realize, which is that most of us are not getting enough protein. We've been told that we're getting more than enough protein. BS. We need about a gram for every pound of desirable body weight. So if you want to be 120 pounds, you should probably be looking at 120 grams of protein. And that, plus maybe a supplement like HMB, which I'd be happy to talk about, that's a supplement that's been around for 20 years, helps you to hold on to muscle, helps you to not lose muscle. You still got to use your weights and you still got to eat your high quality protein, but that's a really big adjunct to the preservation of muscle. And I can't tell you how important preservation of muscle is for menopausal women. It makes all the difference in the world.
It really sets you, when you've got good muscle mass, it sets you up for aging well. It's not just menopause. Like when you're thinking about being an older woman, you don't want to be a frail older woman. You want to be a strong older woman who can still walk, who can still run around with her grandkids.
Open a jar, take your groceries out of the car. Yes, these are important things. Frailty is one of the, I don't know if it's a cause of death, but it's certainly a cause of the decline of the quality of life.
Yeah,
you don't want to be frail.
Yeah. So we want to stay strong. So I love that you're talking about this, Johnny. I love that you're talking about doing some weights. I myself love the kettlebell, but you've got all sorts of things. You can do whatever you like. You can go to the gym. You can do a home workout. There's so many things on YouTube, but it is an essential part of life. You want to live life, you need to do your exercise. You need to do your weights. So
yep. It's not just cardio. It's in fact, if I had to choose, someone put a gun to my head and said, menopausal woman, you got one choice. You can either do cardio or you can do strength training. I'm going to go with the strength training.
Yeah, me too. So we've been everywhere today. We've been at cholesterol, we've been at insulin, we've been at menopause and aging well. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss with the listeners?
Well, I would mention that the supplement that I mentioned earlier, I went over very quickly, HMB, it stands for hydroxymethylbutyrate. It is actually a substance, a chemical that's a metabolic byproduct of the amino acid leucine. And the amino acid leucine, which is one of the 3 branched chain amino acids, is the one that is most involved with preservation of muscle and the making of muscle. Unfortunately, we don't get enough leucine, and we definitely don't get enough HMB unless we supplement with it. It's an easy supplement to get. Many different companies make it. The dose that seems to be most effective to preserve muscle and even to gain some is 3,000 milligrams a day, and the latest studies show that it is even more effective if you take it with, guess what, vitamin D, which I'm sure you know is one of, if you probably took 50 practitioners and said, what are your 3 top supplements for most people in the world, almost all of them are going to include vitamin D as one of those.
Yeah. And I live in a hot country, a country that's renowned for its sunshine, and I take my vitamin D every day.
I live in Southern California and I play tennis 2 hours a day in the sun, and I take 5,000 IUs of vitamin D every day.
Yeah, but I'm also a big fan of test, don't guess. So go and have a look. You might be surprised. You might be pleasantly surprised, but more than likely, unfortunately, across the board, we all seem to be low in vitamin D these days. Yeah. So Dr. Johnny, thank you so much for your time today. How can our listeners find you?
Johnny Bowden. It's at Johnny Bowden on Instagram, at JONNY BOWDEN. Dr. Johnny Bowden on Facebook. No H in Johnny, and I have a website, johnnybowden.com. And
guys, I highly recommend you grab some of Johnny's books. He's got 15 of them, but
yes.
I highly recommend the cholesterol range that you've got. You're more than welcome.
Nice to talk to you, Jen. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Menopause Natural Solutions. This podcast contains general information about menopause. It is provided as a guide, and it is not intended to replace medical advice. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend.